Good morning and welcome to the 24th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I ask everyone in the public gallery to please switch off or turn your devices to silent? Item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 3 and 4 in private this morning? Agreed. Thank you. Item 2 is the Section 22 report, the 2018-19 audit of the Scottish Prison Service. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. The evidence session will take place in a round table format as you're seated, with the aim of encouraging discussion. As usual, MSPs will ask questions from witnesses, but witnesses can also ask questions from each other if you wish. However, we still want to retain some structure to the discussion, so please indicate to me or to the two clerks sitting beside me if you would like to contribute. And when you speak, your microphone will be activated automatically, so there's no need to touch your console. I'm going to ask to go round the table and if everyone can introduce themselves. My name's Jenny Mara and I'm convener of the Public Audit Committee.
Good morning, convener. My name is Michael Guy and I'm the Director of Kilmarnock Prison.
Good morning, I'm Liam Kerr, North East Region MSP and Deputy Convener of the Committee.
Good morning everyone, I'm Nigel Ironside, I'm the Chair of the Prison Governors Association in Scotland.
Alec Neil, MSP for Airdrie Shotts.
Good morning, Anas Sarwar, MSP for Glasgow.
Owen Beattie, MSP for Midlothian North and Musselburgh.
Good morning, I'm Tony Simpson, Director of UK Custodial Operations for Sodexo, representing Adderville Prison.
I'm Willie Coffey, MSP, Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley.
Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, I'm the Chief Inspector of Prisons Scotland.
Bill Bowman, MSP for the North East of Scotland.
Phil Fairley, Chairman of the Prison Officers Association Scotland.
Okay. We're still expecting Steve Farrell, but he's been held up due to an accident and he's going to join us in a short while. I'm going to ask Alec Neil to open questioning for the committee.
Okay, I'll be very short, convener. No doubt everybody will have read the report from the Auditor General. And it doesn't make good reading in terms of the challenges facing the prison service, not just the financial challenges, but also the challenge of rising prisoner numbers and that compared to the capacity of the prison service. And there are particular issues that I know my colleagues want to raise later, for example, in relation to Berlin. But for me, Exhibit 5 in the report sums up both the challenges and the opportunities. If you look at Exhibit 5 in the report, I'll just pick a couple of examples. Supervised bail as an alternative to remand has fallen from 917 cases at its height in 2005-06 to just 268 cases in 17-18. As professionals, do you think we could be doing more to get more people on supervised bail as an alternative to going into prison? Convictions for domestic abuse have contributed to over 400 additional prisoner places over the last decade, and new provisions can accelerate growth in prisoners convicted of domestic abuse. What are the implications for that? Is there a better way of dealing with domestic abuse? We have the Caledonia programme, for example, that's been reasonably successful. Do we need to be expanding that so that we don't end up with far too many people in prison who don't necessarily need to be there? I just picked those two examples. There are many others here. So I would like to hear from the professionals in the 7 areas identified in Exhibit 5. How do you think more can be done? And let's not just look at this in terms of what the prison service itself can do, but we have to address what the wider Scottish Government and justice portfolio can do to address these issues. So I would like some feedback on these points.
Would any of our witnesses like to open up in response to Mr. Neil? Yes, Nigel Ironside.
Well, good morning, everyone. I think supervised bail is a matter for the police, so we have no locus on that. However, I think an increased use of such mechanisms would be welcome. The Scottish Government undertook a review of electronic monitoring in 2016 and accepted the outcome of the working group's report. So there's the means there to be able to divert from custody. I think the issue that we are all experiencing currently is this inexorable rise. This morning we unlocked 8,200 98 people, and there were approximately 38 of those were on home detention curfew. So that places extraordinary pressure on the system, and just looking at our occupancy report for last September, there are only 3 establishments that are operating under capacity, and that's because deliberately they have been left, and that includes Polmont, the Cotton Vale, and the Open Estate. The rest of the system is under significant pressure. There are some good news. There is good news. Young offenders numbers have dropped year on year over the last 5 years, and that so something continues to be correct there. But I think we should be looking at all means necessary to be able to try and reduce the prison's population. The report's quite clear around some of those issues. The Control of Release Act, which actually removes automatic early release for long-term prisoners, that whole principle of longer sentences. 70% of High Court business is dealing with legacy sexual crime, so that is increasing the amount of elderly prisoners coming into custody. And just as that as an example, we have somewhere in the region of about 1,300 prisoners over the age of 50. And 50, and no disrespect to anybody in the room, but 50 is the recognised age where to be deemed as an older prisoner, because presentation of physiology in prison is about 10 to 15 years older than the general population. So that represents about 16% of the overall population. They're coming into prison later in life, doing longer sentences, and therefore we are dealing with a whole cohort, changing cohort of the prison's population that requires a different approach and a different response. But, so we welcome the ability to be able to limit that input, but we have to take who the court send us.
Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon.
I agree completely with everything Nigel has said. And I think it's really important sometimes to look at justice as a business and to follow the numbers. And when you look at the numbers, the rising prison population, and yet we have a drop in crime in Scotland, you know, when you look at the rise that the Scottish Prison Service is facing in violence, in staff absence, you've then got a real problem that you need to resolve. I would love to see an increase in supervised bail to actually bring our remand statistics more in line with our European partners. You know, we're operating at around 20% in Scotland on remand. It would be wonderful to reduce that by half and reduce the pressure on the Scottish Prison Service. It would also be nice to look at the lessons learned from the whole systems approach and the reduction in the juveniles in prison, and to see whether any of that could actually be stepped and repeated up the way to an older age group. So Nigel's mentioned the age maturation of older people in prison. It's also true in the reverse effect with younger people. Brain maturation for younger people means that they're not reaching the levels of maturity that they used to reach until they're about 26. So it would be really nice to see the population between 21 and 26 coming down to the same levels as the under 18s have come down to. It does require a whole system approach. It's not something that just the Scottish Prison Service can do.
Would anyone else like to respond to this general opening question before I bring in Colin Beattie? Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mina. One of the things that jumps out at me here is in connection with the sickness absence. Why, very simple question, why is sickness absence increasing, and why is it so much higher than south of the border? Anybody got any idea?
Nigel Ironside?
Well, sick absence is the reason sick absence increases is due to a number of factors. It is a challenge. Prisons operate on a regime system that requires a level of staffing to maintain the safety of both those in custody and those working there at the time. So when the system is under pressure with increased numbers, then what happens in order to maintain a regime delivery is that you move staff around in order to make the regime work. That, however, places increased stress on those who are the regular and maintained attenders within the establishment. So it is a challenge when staff go off that we then have to mix and match the teams that manage the estate. So that places stressors on individuals, and as a result, they go off. And it just so happens our absence management policy does not tends to favour those who remain long-term sick than short-term sick. So governors do all they can to bring prison staff back to work. But in the case of Barlinnie, for example, where there might already be something like 30 to 40 vacancies within the establishment, that actually there might be 40 to 50 staff off sick absent on any one day. So even starting that regime with a regular staffing group is a challenge. And that, as I say, places stresses on other staff. So it tends to snowball.
Phil Fairley, do you want to come in on this? Yes.
A lot of what Nigel said I agree with entirely also, but I think the sick absence in Scotland, some of that's to do with the change in the environment, the overcrowding, the increase in the violence, the psychoactive substance and the impact it's having on the regime is actually a fairly new and recent thing, and I think that's had an impact on staff's awareness of how to deal with that environment, how to cope in that environment. I think it's left a much more unsettled staff group than we've had for quite considerable time. We've got very stable, organised, well-run prisons, and I think what we're getting at the moment is there's still stable, well-run, organised prisons, but there's a less certainty amongst the staff group about what it is they're dealing with. Some of the type of violence, some of the mental health issues that we're dealing with, the numbers, the growth in the mental health issues we're dealing with is a real challenge for some of the staff, and some of them are struggling to cope with that. I think when they go off, I think our absence management policy is without doubt an elephant in the room to some extent in terms of how we manage absence, between the difference between short and long term. But I think the prison service in Scotland, I think one of the differences between us and down south is the age profile of the staff. We've got a much more mature, longer serving staff group than down south. And when they go sick in their 40s and 50s, in terms of the retirement age now having disappeared into the horizon for a lot of the staff, the thought to come back is a much more difficult one to make, and actually an awful lot of staff that are off sick just now will not return to the service. They won't come back. We won't see them returning, and they'll be replaced by new staff coming in at the start of a career. Down in England, actually, they've got a much bigger turnover. They've got a lot more younger staff with less service, and I think they've just got a better capacity to deal with it at that stage and age in their life. We've got an awful lot of staff who the thought of coming back is just too much for them.
That's something different from what we've heard up to now. I mean, it's the first I've heard that there's a problem in getting staff to come back, especially in their 40s and 50s. Is it just burnout? Is it stress? What's causing that? I mean, that is not a normal reaction.
No, I don't, but I think the change to retirement age for prison officers is a factor in terms of how people see what it is they're coming back to and how long they're coming back to it for. There's an awful lot of stuff. Personally, I'm one of the staff who had a retirement age of 60, who's now got a retirement age of 67. If I'm an officer working on the galleries, dealing with this new environment, much more unsettled, unpredictable mental health issues, the violence, the tension, the thought of coming back to that's a lot less pleasant and easier to make that step than coming back knowing about 5 years to go rather than 12 years to go. So
the change in the culture in the prison, in terms of the prisoners, is what is the problem, rather than the culture in the prison service itself, just to separate the two.
Yeah, it's environment, dealing with the overcrowding and the rise in the temperature, the unpredictability from the mental health and the psychoactive substances, the increase in the violence, all of that contributes to a working environment that, for a lot of the staff, has either been something they experienced much earlier in their career and hasn't been there for a while, or have never experienced it before. The numbers of staff who leave through capability or medical retirement in the prison service has gone through the roof. And that's simply to do with people looking at how long they've got to come back and endure that for before they reach retirement. And for some of them, it's just too big a step.
I mean, the evidence shows that there's a disproportionately high percentage of sickness absence due to stress. I mean, how effectively is that being managed? What is being done to address that, which would perhaps assist with some of the things that you're highlighting?
Please, Phil.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're managing that well enough. I don't. The numbers of staff who go off with stress-related illnesses, mental health issues themselves, is another number that has grown enormously recently.
So what would management have to do to manage that stress better, which obviously would have a knock-on effect with the older workers as well?
I think the service has been asked to deal with far too many prisoners with mental health issues, really complex, difficult, challenging characters inside the prison, and I don't think staff are properly and adequately skilled or trained to deal with the extent of the mental health issues that we're being confronted with. That in itself is leading to mental health issues for staff, and I don't think there's enough support in either direction. I think if we brought in the proper specialist skills to assist staff in dealing with those issues inside the prison, it would help. But when staff themselves fall victim to that, I'm not sure as an organisation we go far enough in terms of providing them the specialist help they need.
So what does happen in terms of, I mean, you've highlighted, and certainly we've seen from other evidence, that there is an increase in mental health issues among prisoners. What skills are staff being given in this regard? Is there anything to support them?
There's more awareness training in terms of recognising signs and first response kind of things, but I'm not sure that's, well, I know for a fact it's not far enough in terms of giving staff the skills and the confidence to know what it is that they're dealing with. When it's themselves that's dealing with their own mental health as a consequence of that, I think we give them access to employee assistance programme, which in itself is a good system, but when you're dealing with complex mental health issues, it's not enough. I don't think the access to sessions that they get is long enough, or it's intensive enough for dealing with the issues that are starting to be identified amongst staff.
Okay. I'm going to bring in a couple of other people on these points. Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon.
Let me just say I absolutely agree with both speakers beforehand. I think the concepts of overcrowding, the impact of psychoactive substances, the changing environment with serious and organised crime, with a vast number increase of sex offenders, the explosion in mental health that is felt in society and is replicated into the prison, the age profile of staff and prisoners, those are all significant factors that need to be taken into account. In my experience, and as I've done all the inspections and spoken to staff and to prisoners, the two items that come out most strongly is their concern about whether they're dealing with mental health correctly, whether they've actually got the right approach. And the second one that comes out is the psychoactive substances. And I think it's important to remember that psychoactive substances are relatively new. And I keep quoting the Ebola virus. If you think about when the world first hit the Ebola virus, we didn't know what to do. And that was also true a few years ago when psychoactive substances came into play. And nowadays, there is a kind of reaction to that we're beginning to recognise mental health first aid training for staff, how to deal with psychoactive substances and the difficulties of excited delirium. Those are in train, but they're not embedded, and they need to be embedded. The third thing for me is mental health, and it's really important to remember that Scotland has a national problem with recruiting sufficient mental health staff, both in prisons to support the other staff, but also in the community.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Michael Guys, the first voice this morning from the private sector, HMP Kilmarnock.
Thank you, Convener. Agreeing with the points, and I won't go back over the points that have previously been said, but you know, the prisoner population that our staff are dealing with is far more complex, and it is quite a difficult population to manage, not just with mental health, but with behavioural and with some of the drug abuse and behaviours that are going on. So it's important to, you know, we recognise at Circle, we try and recognise that it's not just work-related stress that our staff are being absent with, but it's also, you know, wider stresses and wider well-being issues. So there is quite a lot of work. We hope, we recognise that we can bring our people back to work as quickly as possible. So we do put quite a lot of measures in place to support them, both training to prevent them going off. And when people do go off, you know, we have counsellors, employee assistance programmes, so people that they can speak to and actually help them back into the workplace, hopefully, you know, on a kind of permanent basis.
Okay. I've got a couple of supplementaries on this point. Liam Kerr then and Anas Sarwar.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Just to summarise what we've heard so far, Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, you said that a number of things are presenting, so the mental health, the age profile, new psychoactive substances and rising numbers. Now, it seems to me that all of these things can have been predicted. I mean, the new psychoactive substances, I take your point entirely that it's new by definition, but I think we only have 3 Rapiscan machines in the service that are going around. I think, I may be wrong on this, but that it's still at pilot stage. The rising numbers we've seen in the report is a trend over time. So it seems to me that these issues haven't come out of nowhere, so could action have been taken earlier? And if so, by whom?
Do you want me to answer that?
If you have an answer. Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon.
I'm not sure I do have an answer. I can't tell you how many Rapiscan machines there are. I certainly, over a year ago, went into both Kilmarnock and Addywell, both of whom had Rapiscan machines, and were having significantly positive results. Out of those, I think that the Scottish Prison Service have been investing in Rapiscans. The last 2 prisons we've inspected both had Rapiscans. I couldn't tell you how many there are across the estate. Perhaps Nigel can.
Sorry, Michael Guy's telling me he has 2 in HMP Kilmarnock. You're saying there's only 3 in the whole estate, Liam?
Well, that may be on the SPS prisons.
Right. Okay. Tony Simpson.
Yes, good morning. So at Addywell we have a Rapiscan machine. I think we can't underestimate just how hard psychoactive substances and how fast they hit the system. Addywell was at the forefront of that, and I think we felt some of the brunt and we did some hard learning early on, but that did have an effect, I think, around the place. So going back to stress management, very much like Michael, our view is it's a whole person approach, it's a well-being approach, and our kind of recent learning is that the real focus has to be on making sure that you get that balance right, that our shift patterns allow people to get that work-life balance correct, that people feel safe at their work, and that they feel that they're being well led, well managed and well listened to. And that's the focus of our attention going forward.
Let me just drill back for a second onto the drugs machines, these rapid scan machines. Both private prisons have these machines, and you feel they're making a discernible difference? Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon's nodding quite vigorously. You feel they're making a difference, Wendy?
I mean, if you were to read the Addywell inspection report, you'll see that we complement the relationship between Police Scotland and Addywell in their driving the agenda around dealing with psychoactive substances. I've also noticed that in Kilmarnock and Barlinnie, recently in Glenocle, both had Rapiscan machines, and we're beginning to see a demonstrable effect. Something like, I think if I remember rightly, 30% of mail coming through was contaminated that was picked up by the Rapiscan machine that wouldn't have been picked up otherwise.
Okay, I'm going to ask Nigel Ironside why there aren't more of these in the public sector, and then I'm going to bring in Anas Sarwar.
Well, thank you for that, Kavina. I think, largely speaking, the evidence is probably emerging on the effectiveness of Rapiscans. It is psychoactive substances is a recipe, and the recipe changes. And what we saw earlier, or at the early stages of it, was testing. So people would be given psychoactive substance to test its potency, and what we saw was some extreme responses to that, which staff were having to deal with because it was out in the open. As that recipe has changed and stabilized over time, then prisoners who are polydrug users know what they're taking. So Rapiscan certainly has a place, but there will always be, as long as we allow the issue of mail and personal communication to come into prisons, we will always have that challenge. And the manner in which they have introduced it is a constant battle. So you would have to ask.
Totally convinced of their effectiveness. Is that a fair
I
summary
think
of your answer?
the evidence is still emerging as to how effective it is.
Okay, thank you. Anas Sarwar.
I was going to take it back, Convener, for a moment, just to the mental health angle. you spoke a bit about, particularly Phil Fairley and Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, around the level of training that staff are being given around dealing with mental health issues. I was wondering what capacity there is actually in the workplace, i.e. the prison, in terms of actual clinical support. So around the mental health debate, we're talking a lot around having mental health nurses around our GP practices, around our schools, around our college and university campuses. What clinical specialisms, what mental health nurses, what mental health counsellor capacity actually exists within prisons on a day-to-day basis?
It operates under the principle of equivalence. So the healthcare that's provided in a prison is supposedly similar to that which is provided into the community. What we've discovered is there's some excellent professionals out there, no question, prepared to provide support, but there is a real difficulty in recruiting sufficient professionals to meet the need.
So does that mean every prison would have a mental health nurse or counsellor
Yes.
on site
Yes.
at all times, in and
No,
out?
not at all.
No.
So they're not there in the evening, and many prisons suffer from an absolute inability to be able to recruit sufficient to meet the need.
Right. So there's a specific vacancy rate in terms of
Yes.
the mental health nurse and counsellor
Yes.
capacity on the estate?
Yes, but that's true of the community as well. That's not
Right.
just limited to the
And
prisons.
is there a difference again in the public and private sector in terms of the ability to recruit mental health capacity on site?
All the healthcare, just if I can just interrupt, my apologies, all of the healthcare is under the National Health Service.
Right.
So it's not
So
the...
you wouldn't
no difference.
contract someone in, or?
It's exactly the same for the private sector.
Right.
It's NHS Scotland led.
Right, okay.
If I can maybe just go back to some of the detail of the actual report. Round about paragraph 16, the Auditor General says that the Scottish Prison Service made one-off one-off payments to operational staff on 3 separate occasions, totalling 13.9 million for their engagement and continued support of its plans for organisational development. But the auditor noted that there was no success criteria, so it wasn't possible to determine whether these payments represented value for money. So my question to them, first to the management side, is how can you make a payment over 3 times without knowing what it was for or how you would measure the value? And then from the staff side, were the staff aware of what the bargain was, and did they provide what was required from them?
Well, thank you, but I'm here representing the Prison Governors Association Scotland, not SPS Management. So Prison Governors Association Scotland did not agree with the payments that were made to staff in that regard because they were based around engagement in the revisions of working practice. So we were not supportive of that. So if you would have to ask the question of the Chief Executive and his team as to why he wished to make those payments. From Prison Governors Association, that we were excluded from those discussions and from the principles around those payments. So the expectation that we would have had was that if such payments were going to be made, then there would be some tangible outcome for that. But as you will be aware, the Prison Officers Professionalisation Programme was not successful in being voted through. So we question too the efficacy of such payments.
We're going to hear, Mr. Woman, from the Scottish Prison Service at a future session, but I think it is worth finding out how it operates on the ground.
Or perhaps the Chief
Wendy
Inspector.
Sinclair-Gibbon.
Yes.
I can't actually add to that debate at all. My apologies.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Phil Fairley, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so the background to where this came from at all actually came from the trade union threatening to run a ballot for industrial action back in 2013 over the pay. Long-standing grievance amongst the operational frontline staff, believing that the pay has just failed to, for a very long time, recognise and reward the role appropriately. So the long and the short of this deal was that in conversation with the Chief Executive and Scottish Government, it was agreed that they were going to take the time to bring in a new model for the Scottish Prison Service that was about professionalising the service. The professionalisation agenda was the trade unions agenda originally. And the reason we went down that path is we believed that was the best route to get them properly recognised and rewarded for the role that we do in comparison to other uniform and professional services. The timescale that was required for that to happen meant that the trade union would hold off running a ballot for industrial action, and the response for holding off the ballot were those payments. And that was all that was required, and it was all that was agreed that would take place during the time frame over that. Otherwise, the trade union would have gone to a ballot for industrial action, and I have to say to you, I'm absolutely certain what the result of that ballot would have been.
Okay, Bill Bowman.
So, that's an interesting schism, and obviously we'll come back to that. But I wonder, just for clarity, as an HM Inspector, would you not know about?
I knew all about
or
that.
Or being involved and interested in it?
Absolutely not involved, not in the decision making, and it's nothing. No, it's absolutely not within my remit.
I think that's a fair response. Okay. Phil Fairley, if I can just drill down on that for a minute. I mean, you're the leader of that trade union, the Prison Officers Association.
The Scottish Chair, yeah.
So it held off industrial action in your view. But
held off the ballot.
Yes.
Yeah.
What we've heard from the auditors is that it doesn't seem a very, how do I find the words, very transparent or thorough or proper way of pay awards. Do you agree with that? Do you think this should be a bit more formalised? It should be, or are you happy with the system as it's operating now?
No, and actually I don't think anybody came out of that process particularly happy. It's not, we wouldn't regard that as a pay award at all. Actually it was about everybody buying the time and space to do the piece of work in terms of developing a professionalisation programme to bring in, and the reward in terms of pay and conditions would have come at the far end of that. This was simply about the interim period and how we bought the time and space to let the piece of work take place.
Average salary for a prison officer?
If at the very top of the scale, it's 30,000. Well, sorry, it's just gone up from the recent pay deal, but it was 30,000 at the time. Coming in at the start as an operations officer, it was 18,000.
Okay, so instead of this ex gratia payment system that you've got, what would you like to see?
Well, actually, I think the pay award we've just done has gone some way to starting to address the issues that we've been raising with the employer and the government for a very long period of time. The operational front line have got probably one of the best public sector pay deals anywhere in the UK in this round of pay talks, and it's the first time for a very long time that they feel that recognition is starting to come. So
it could be that this ex gratia system is phased out?
The ex gratia is what we use as an alternative to overtime. That's a separate thing to the pay.
Okay, Willie Coffey.
I think it's important to just hear the views of the panel in advance of hearing from the SPS formally on this, because as an audit committee we're interested in the public pound, and there's a discussion obviously about the flatlining of the overall budget allocation to the SPS or a real times drop, depending on how you look at it. But here we have an example where £14 million has been spent on this, plus another £2.45 million on equal pay claims that presumably resulted from that. So it's important for us, I think, as a committee to get some kind of handle or some kind of view on that before we speak to the SPS, and your views would be most welcome in how you saw this and whether there was justification for it.
Well, from a trade union point of view, I would argue there absolutely was justification for it, because the alternative was that we were going to have prison officers running a ballot for industrial action, and I'm certain taking industrial action. The purpose of that industrial action would be to have engaged with the employer for a substantial pay award that we think was long overdue. So that was either going to happen back then or it was going to happen further down the line. I think what the prison service were getting back in exchange in that time frame was a programme and a plan that was going to professionalise the service in a way beyond where it sits at the moment. It was going to introduce a recognised professional academic qualification for the role that we did, and it was going to bring in new practices in terms of the professional delivery inside our prison. So there was plenty in it for the prison service had we managed to get it over the line at the far end of that process. It's not that it was just simply about buying off the strike. The programme that was being developed and offered up made real difference to what was going to be delivered inside the prisons.
Has it been abandoned though, or is there plans to?
Yeah, it was overwhelmingly rejected in the ballot. There's a whole load of things in the background as to how that came about, but it was overwhelmingly rejected with the staff, and at this moment in time it's dead in the water.
There's no plans to revive an alternative proposal? Or?
Not at the moment. There's nothing come on the table, and I think that's probably about as much to do with time and climate and environment rather than anything else. It's not about the willingness to engage or whether we still see it as a right path to take.
Right, good.
I think we need to pick this up with the employers, the Scottish Prison Service as well, but I believe Governors, Nigel Ironside, you'd like to come in on this now?
Yes, I think prison governors were actually really disgusted at the manner in which this was done. It excluded completely operational prison governors who take the responsibilities in terms of management and accountability in managing prisons across the country. So for there not to be an outcome for that investment is hugely disappointing. And I wear two hats here. Well, today I'm here as chair of the Prison Governors Association, but I am a governor of 16 years standing. And so when we see this happening and looking at the pressures that are built onto management teams in terms of the responsibilities that they have to take, the decision making that they have to take, we align in so much as there is operational responsibility that just does not equate to other environments, other management environments, because the people we are responsible for, their livelihood, the environment in which they live and their safety is ours and ours alone. So it is particularly difficult to accept when there is such a level of investment and nothing comes from it. Notwithstanding that, I do think it is worthwhile speaking to SPS, particularly to understand the rationale as to why it was only ever targeted at operational uniform staff, because that question has one that's not been answered to the Prison Governors Association.
Convener, I mean, there's consequences right through the service for whatever happens here, and we were discussing earlier about behaviours and changes in behaviours within the service and the reasons that bring that about. But one of the Auditor General's charts in Exhibit 6 shows us that there was been a huge drop in the what's called purposeful activity hours that prisoners engage in or enjoy during the course of the year. And I think it only relates to the SPS, so it'd be helpful if Michael could clarify whether that happens at Bowhouse as well. But that's a huge drop in the purposeful activity and prisoner activity there. And we were wondering what the reason for that was. I think we could probably guess what some of the reasons are, but I'd like to hear your views on that and whether that has had this negative impact on prisoner behaviour that's been described earlier.
Yeah.
Michael Guy.
Well, I'm assuming that Adwell was the same. So we are measured as part of our contract on our purposeful activity. And over the 2 years that the Exhibit 6 talks about, we have not curtailed our regimes at all. So we've still been delivering full regimes for prisoners during these times. Some of the reasons why things are changing, you know, I'm seeing in my prison that we've got far more prisoners who are assessed as being unfit to attend purposeful activities. As of Monday, I had 120 out of 600 prisoners being assessed by, you know, our NHS professionals as being unfit to attend work. So that's been a change I've seen over recent years about the availability, about prisoners engaging with activities rather than availability.
Tony Simpson.
Yes, just to follow on from Michael, yes, exactly the same. Availability of purposeful activity is a key part of our contractual delivery. It's measured forensically by the SPS on a daily basis, and we're held to account if we don't meet our contractual obligations. And we meet those contractual obligations. So that's the position as far as availability goes. We work hard to get people to go to those activities. I think motivation is always a challenge, particularly with some of the prisoners that we look after. But we are held very much to account in terms of making that available. So it's not something that we would curtail unless it was an absolute last resort, because that would impact on our contractual performance.
Nigel Ironside.
There are a number of reasons as to why purposeful activity might fall, particularly if to meet staffing obligations within the residential environment to manage prisoners in the halls, then that is always the first priority. So the victim, if you like, of redeployment of staff is often those work sheds and work environments that prisoners would otherwise attend. There is and I echo Tony and Michael's view around motivation. The motivation of the population to work and to engage in purposeful activity is a constant and ever present challenge. And I honestly, in 20 years of being in prison, I in prisons, should I say. I don't know what the answer is to that. All we can do is provide the mechanisms and the opportunities for people to learn and to engage and to work, but they continue to not do so. It has to be said, though, that the recent increase in numbers of a factor of about 700, which is about a large prison within Scotland, means that actually the ability to be able to provide purposeful activity for everybody is compromised.
Willie Coffey.
I'm glad to hear what Michael Guy said there about Kilmarnock. I think Adi will as well, that there's been no reduction in this activity. What I'm trying to get at, is there any correlation between the huge drop in these hours and the behaviours of the prisoners within the estate?
I don't think I'm in a position to comment on that, because we don't, you know, this is SPS data, not Kilmarnock prison data.
But perhaps, Wendy, can you cast any light in this at all?
Yes, gladly. So in all our reports, you'll have noticed that we've raised concerns about purposeful activity. Let me be clear. The range of purposeful activity opportunities in many, many prisons is really good, really excellent. However, as Nigel mentioned, the numbers of prisoners going through, so Barlinnie's operating at about 50% overcrowding. They cannot have the space in which to give purposeful activity to every prisoner. They can't. You've got all sorts of other problems. I don't think the behaviours of the prisoners are quite the thing, but the reality is, when you look at the keep separates, that is, people who are under threat or are a defined threat to other people, then you have to keep them separate. So, for instance, HMP Edinburgh has to operate a minimum of 5 different regimes, trying to get 5 different batches of people to have enough purposeful activity is really complex and difficult. If you add in the keep separates, you add in the age profile, where you've got a lot of people unfit to work, you add in the people who've got mental health problems and just want to self-socially isolate, you suddenly have a problem providing purposeful activity. But in every prison I've inspected so far, the opportunity for purposeful activity is not filled by getting enough people into the purposeful activity, combined with the high sickness level, which means that staff are redeployed away in order to keep the halls safe.
Bill Fairley, you wanted to come in on this? Your summary there, Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, it reflects my experience exactly visiting prisons. I was in Perth a couple of years ago, and the classroom areas were empty, and this was in the morning, a prime time for purposeful activity.
One of the other major problems is substance misuse and prescribed medication. So the massive increase in the gabapentoids, for instance, meant that, and the change to actually meaning that people have to be supervised having their medication. Perth Prison, for instance, can't get the regime going until everybody's had their medication, which is about 10:30 in the morning. So the morning activities are already constrained by prescribed medication. So it's a major problem.
Okay, I'd like to welcome Steve Farrell to the table from Community Union, who represent the staff and prison officers in the private sector. Steve, I know you've missed some of the session, so please indicate to me when you'd like to come in. I was going to ask, before I bring in Liam Kerr, we know there have been real-term reductions in the Scottish Prison Service budget over the last few years. What impact has that had? Phil Fairley.
From our point of view, the cut in the budget actually came at a time when the exact opposite needed to happen. We can't just continue to ignore the fact that we've got the equivalent of one very large prison in this country and no single extra member of staff to manage that. And that's just simply the frontline operational staff I'm referring to, but everything else that's required to manage an extra 700 prisoners in the system is a cost that should be getting added to the budget, not reduced from the budget. And I think some of the examples that we're talking about just now in terms of the purposeful activity, we have got the staff who are trained to deliver those programmes and skills inside the prison being taken off that role to supplement the operational frontline in the residential areas. So if we had the proper complement to deal with the proper prisoner population, we wouldn't be seeing some of the consequences that we talked about earlier. I think Liam Kerr touched on earlier about we could have predicted some of this happening. I think that's true. We've watched the growth in the prisoner numbers for very many years, and we've always talked about having the biggest number of prisoners in Western Europe inside our system, and we need to do something about that. But every time we've talked about that, the numbers have gone in the opposite direction. So it is predictable, and we need to stop talking in terms of the kind of numbers that we wish we held and start to fund the prison service for the numbers that we are actually holding. And right now, given some of the sentencing policies we've got, I do not see that number coming down, I see it going up. So for the budget to be cut at a time while we're going in the opposite direction numbers-wise just makes no sense to me.
Nigel Ironside.
As a prison governor, recently Governor Glenuchel, my annual budget was around about £17.5 million, and the majority of that, about £13–14 million worth, is staff costs. So in real terms, actually, the amount of real revenue I have to utilise for running of the prison is significantly limited. Some of that is caught up in national contracts, for example, social work delivery and education. Those are devolved to me, but we manage the budget locally. So it is a real challenge, particularly around issues like food, provisions of which again are provided under national contract. So it tends to be that you end up really managing finances at the margin of the core budget, not fundamentally being able to make significant inroads into how to maximise that. So what we've seen, how does that manifest itself across the estate, is that the amount of recruitment that's happening is, generally speaking, based around a model of overall the national picture regarding vacancies, which doesn't actually reflect the operational requirements on the ground, which includes the issues around that we've talked about, around absence, around maternity, around return to work, people coming back to return to work, which are staff that you have to manage but are not deployable in the front line. So it's been a challenge, and particularly issues around maintenance and maintenance of the estate tends to be hit. And when you end up with a broken piece of the jail, be that the front gate or be that the personal alarm system or perimeter security, then the ability to be able to respond quickly to that, although the estates team do an excellent job, is compromised because actually parts aren't readily available. We don't keep lots of those. So it exacerbates the whole issue. There's very little scope for decision making.
Thank you. Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon.
I think the choice is stark. We either have to put less people in prison or recognise that we have to pay for what the prison population we've got. And I agree with everything Nigel and Phil have said. But I think there's the other side, 700 extra prisoners. If we were to build a prison for them, that would be 200 and something million. If we were to run it, that would be between 10 and 20 million. Instead of which, the Scottish Prison Service has been repeatedly asked to cut their budget. But I think there's an additional thing. It is the subcontracts that you've referred to. So, health service. Every health service I meet in every prison tells me they're not funded for the additional people they're having to deal with. And when I think about the health service and the epidemiology, you have deep-end funding into GP practices in areas that are the most deprived. But we don't have deep-end funding into the prisons, and yet the people in the prisons are from those very deprived areas. So I don't think we've actually done the kind of health needs analysis and workforce capacity modelling needed to provide the level of healthcare we actually do. That funding needs looked at. I think there is also the reality that you're having to deal with a very different and complex, more vulnerable population. The older social care, that funding needs looked at. The fact that staff need training in mental health, they need training in dealing with older people, training and dealing with the OLRs, Order for Lifelong Restriction. These are particular cohorts of the prison that require particular skills. And in reality, a year-on-year cut in budget simply means that, as Nigel says, the margins are consistently being cut. Barlinnie is shocking. I urge you to go and have a look at it, to walk along corridors where plaster dust rains on your head, to walk around in the evening and just think, oh my goodness, we actually see Scotland as leading edge in penology, and yet we're happy to ask staff and prisoners to work and live here. So I feel quite strongly, even though I recognise we're in a period of fiscal prudence.
Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, I think the summary you've just given there is excellent. I think it's something that the committee will come back to. I think you make some really interesting points around the extra funding for the vulnerable populations in terms of health and elderly populations. I'm interested to know from the private sector if delivery, I mean, I know it's all delivered by NHS Scotland, but are there the same challenges in terms of delivery in the private sector of healthcare?
I'll speak on behalf of Adwell. Yes, I think so. You know, we're equally affected. There's no distinction between public and private in respect of this. It depends on your geography as much as anything else. But yes, exactly the same issues for us. No distinction.
Okay, Michael's saying same as your answer. Okay, Alec Neil, yes.
And I'd say this is a former health secretary, but the funding was transferred for health provision in prisons from the prisons budget to the health service budget, probably around 2010-11. And obviously, prior to that, prison service was responsible for its own health funding. Are you saying that it might be better to revert to that arrangement because you're not a high priority within the National Health Service?
No, I think that would be a retrograde step. I think that was just evolution. The reality is that the Health and Justice Collaboration Improvement Board, which is in place to look at how health and social care partnerships respond to prisons healthcare, actually having just relinquished the healthcare brief in Scottish Prison Service, I'm really encouraged by the attention that prisons healthcare is getting. I have to say it's been a long time coming, but there is a host of different work ongoing to recognise and include the prisons population as a specialism within NHS itself, which I think is very welcome, because those issues, that complexity of the shape and style of the population is enormous. Dealing with personality disorder, compounded by mental health issues, compounded by comorbid healthcare issues for the elderly, and polydrug use by a significant proportion of the population, means that the health and well-being environment of the prison population needs a completely different approach to one that we've had hitherto. So I don't think giving it back would help. And I think being part of that broader, wider health and social care partnership agenda is to be encouraged.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to stick with funding, if I may. The Audit Scotland report highlights a financial issue with buying extra places in the private estate. Can someone explain to me, just in very basic terms, how the private funding works? So is it that, say, the SPS purchase a finite number of places per year for prisoners, and then any extras are bought at a premium? Is that roughly what's going on here?
Yes, so for the Kilmarnock contract, we are paid on availability for 500 beds, and then anything beyond that, it's paid on occupancy. And there are tranches in which the Scottish Prison Service can instruct us to take additional prisoners. So with the overcrowding, we're currently 96 prisoners overcrowded, so 20%. With the overcrowding, we are paid for those additional prisoner places.
I'll come back to that in a second, if I may, unless you want to say something to that, Tony.
No, it's Much the same model with us. I wouldn't recognise the phrase overcrowding though. The additional places we have are in specially designed double cells, so they're recognised as appropriate prisoner places. It's not a phrase we would recognise, but it's the same model.
Steve Farrell, did you want to come in on this?
Just a couple of things on this, Jerry. What we've got in the private sector is you'll have the additional places, and I see that through the report about this, the private sector and the funding for additional places. But what you've got is the impact on staff on that, and what the impact you've got on the membership within the private sector. Because, for instance, the SPS will give the private contractor, whether that be Serco or Sodexo, the notice that they're going to require the additional places. Serco will then, or Sodexo will then recruit the adequate number of staff. But the problem I've got is the back end of that is because when those places are taken away again, then they're taken away without any notice, and then ultimately they're left with additional staff that most times than not leads to redundancy, in a redundancy situation. So what you've got is them asking for additional places, the private contractor recruiting additional staff with notice, and then without any notice taking those additional places back, and those staff being left without resource and job. Now the issue I have on that as well, in terms of the staffing model, as we talk about the regime and we talk about the purposeful activity, if we, both private prisons, to my mind, for the 20-year Kilmallock has been in situ, I don't think they've ever had a period where purposeful activity has been an issue. The staff have always delivered round about purposeful activity. We don't have the facility that the public sector does in the private sector to close a regime, close a wing, wherever it may well be, because there's a cost to that, and there's a cost implication. But that restriction, and it is a restriction, with that restriction, if I can give you an example of that, in 2002, there was an incident, a major incident at Kilmallock Prison, and it was a level 1 incident. Now, the staff did what they did without any mutual aid. They then put people back behind a cell, whatever it may well be, in terms of they had a secure unlock the following day. Serco were fined quite considerably for not having people in their workplace that next day. That's perverse. That is perverse. If we're talking about purposeful activity and we're talking about doing this thing right, then how can you do your thing in terms of security and proper security at HMP Kilmallock on that day, and the following day be fined hundreds of thousands of pounds for not having prisoners at their work and their work location? Because what happened at Kilmallock on that day would happen at Ballinny, Shotts, Glenorchy and every prison in terms of the requirement for the secure unlock.
Quick question on that, Steve. I mean, surely the fine to Serco doesn't affect your members, does it?
Well, it does, Jenny, because,
how does it?
Because at the end of the day, ultimately, when we go in with the bottom line in terms of that ability to negotiate terms and conditions for our members and improve terms and conditions, because you will note the private sector terms and conditions are still way behind that of the public sector.
So Serco say to you, we can't up your terms and conditions
because
or your pay because we've been fined.
And if you look at
do they say that?
They say that.
Okay.
Because they will look at the key performance indicators, which is in the contract. That and moving on to that, the question I've asked every Justice Secretary since 1999 is when that money is withheld, where is it?
So you think there's a problem with the contracts?
I think there's a problem with the contract, and I think there's a problem with the withheld monies from these private contractors as to where that money goes within the overall purse.
Where do you think it goes?
Well, I don't know, Alec, because I've never seen it audited, and I've never seen it detailed as to where it goes. So, GOA are in line this year to lose £1.2 million. Where does that £1.2 million go? It's a fair question.
Okay, we'll pick that up. Liam Kerr.
Good question. Can I, a very brief one, I have in my mind that the cost of a prisoner for a year is about £36,000. I've no doubt someone can give me that. Is that the same whether it be an SPS prison or a private prison, or is there some variation?
Wendy Sinclair Gibbon, you're shaking your head.
Cost per prisoner will change for every prison. So it's going to be considerably cheaper to have a prisoner in Castle Huntly, the open estate, because the number of staff you require is lower. So other prisons, old Victorian antiquated prisons, require a much higher level of staff. And as Nigel has already explained, then when the percentage of the budget is so high, then inevitably if you need higher numbers of staff, then the cost per prisoner place is going to be higher. So the private sector, and they can talk to their own, but the private sector has the benefit of having a modern prison. So the cost per prisoner placed, to be able to compare apples with apples, you would have to take off the mortgage element, then look at the cost per prisoner place, and look at a comparable modern prison.
I understand. Thank you very much for that. The final question is just something that bothers me out of the report. Can someone explain how come the private prisons have space? If you said earlier, Wendy, that Barlini, I think, was operating at 50% over what it's supposed to, and yet it would appear that the two private prisons have space. How has that come about, and is that in any way sustainable longer term? Will the private prisons be able to absorb any extra capacity that's coming through the system going forward?
On behalf of Addiwell, it's the joy of having a purpose-built prison, where this was preempted at the time of construction and contract award, hence the availability of 96 additional places in double cells. As Michael said, we get paid on the standard 700, as it is for Addiwell, and those cells are held in abeyance. So rather than having two people in it, it would have one in it, if you like. At the point at which SPS needs it, we are ready to go. They press the button, we activate those cells, and they're there for as long as the SPS wants them. And that's the joy of the contract, I think, that we can switch on and switch off depending on demand. We would struggle to go beyond 796 if that's the question that you're asking, and we're not designed to go above that. And we would have to have some serious discussions about what that would look like, but we can't see a world where we could go beyond that based on current...
96 is capacity in
796 is capacity for us in Addiwell, yes.
Okay. Michael Guy, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it was just a couple of things, and just following on from what Stevie talked about, you know, that we operate under a commercial contract where the fee was for Kilmarnock. It was, you know, the payment mechanism was set up in 1997. So, you know, going back to 2002, it would have been local negotiations, and the fee we received from the Scottish Prison Service had to pay for staff, had to pay for any abatements for KPIs, has to pay for the maintenance of the building. So you have that pot of money that we were able to spend. So, you know, that would put a bit of context to what Stevie was saying there, you know, that it all came out that one pot. It is, you know, there is the ability to put additional prisoners into Kilmarnock if the SPS choose to do so, but the risk of doing so beyond where we currently are is exactly the same for every prison. You know, more prisoners into a smaller space, you know, could cause further aggravations and concerns. You know, I would be concerned about that.
Okay. The Auditor General was very clear in her report about the pressures on Barlini Prison in the east of Glasgow, so I'm going to ask Anas Sarwar to ask questions on that point.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose most of these questions are probably most relevant to Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, but others please do feed in. Obviously, with Barlini being over 50% over capacity, looking at Exhibit 6 in the Auditor General's report around prisoner assaults, prison activity, and around substance misuse, would it be safe to say that in all those statistics, Barlini probably skews the stats, so it would be particularly worse in Barlini compared to other prisons in the estate? So, for example, around prisoner on staff assaults, whether it be minor or major assaults, prisoner on prisoner crimes, would the stats be disproportionately higher in Barlini, and that correlating with the fact that it's over capacity by 50%?
I think it's important to separate what it means. So Barlini has more prisoners than any other prison in Scotland, so their statistics will be higher. Proportionately, no.
Right. And so you don't think there's a correlation between the overcapacity and the attacks on either whether it be staff or prisoner on prisoner attacks? You don't think there's a correlation?
I do. But
right.
I think that's true of every prison and not just Barlini. So Barlini is perhaps more overcrowded than some of the other prisons, and therefore they have gone for, if you look at their purposeful activity figures, they're very low.
Yep.
Because they really make a huge effort to keep it safe and controlled. Part of that means an awful lot of people are not getting out of cell very much.
Yeah. And Nigel Ironside gave the example of around 30 to 40 vacancies at Barlini at any one time, and up to 50 staff being off sick at any one time in Barlini. Again, would there be a correlation between the 50% overcapacity and the sickness absence rate at Barlini?
That's probably a
a reasonable conclusion. I think the whole principle which we've spoken about is that when you're managing a prison with high numbers, and just to put it in perspective, most of the other establishments are somewhere in the region of 110 to 115% overcrowded. Berlin, as of last month, September, 140% occupancy. So that correlation between the principle of safety and keeping a prison safe, and I would ask Wendy to give her view on safety in Scottish prisons, because we do pride ourselves on the fact that prisons in Scotland are safe environments. That might not appear to be the case with the statistics that you have before you. But the reality is that in order to manage a prison's population safely, you have to manage the control, the movement, the access, the open environment in which those in our care live and work in order to manage or minimise those incidents. But the reality is, because of the issues that we've heard about around the implications of assaults come not directly from the fact that people are taking psychoactive substances, but the fact that debt is incurred by those who use them, and it's the issues around enforcement of the debt that causes the violence.
Point out that I think at least 10 of our prisons are overcrowded. It's not just Berlin, and although Berlin is by far the biggest percentage overcrowded, the violence is spread right across the state. It's not focused and solely related to overcrowding. So 10 of the prisons are sitting overcrowded today. There's still a variation in terms of staff absence and the levels of violence in all of those prisons. I think Pullman, at the moment, is probably our highest sick absence level, although it's not sitting in the same position as some of the prisons such as Berlin. Do you mind if I just jump back quickly to something that Liam Kerr had raised earlier in terms of the contract? I think Steve Farrell mentioned that when the numbers go up in the private sector, new staff get taken on to manage that. I wish that was the case in the private sector, and actually it's where a big part of the problem for us is coming. In the public sector, we're just asked to absorb that. The money that the public sector prisons then pay to the private sector as a premium to buy those spaces comes from a budget that's already decreasing. So the impact isn't just that we don't get the extra staff. Actually, what we're losing is some of the resource to run the public sector prisons to fund the private sector at a time when our budget's been cut.
I'm going to bring Liam Kerr back in on this, and I'll come back to you and ask.
Phil, it's a good point. Does that not come back to a failure of planning? Right, I'll run this through. I don't know if this is right or not, but is it not a case that somebody somewhere has failed to plan for a rise in population in terms of buying places up front at the private prisons, and thus you're leading to the overcrowding because there aren't sufficient places except at a premium in the private sector? Would it be better to wind back and at the start of the process say, well, look, we've got an increasing population, therefore we need to plan for more prisoners, therefore we need to buy private places at a lower cost without doing it as a kind of an emergency later on?
I think the prison service use of those extra spaces in the private sector are done as a last resort simply because of the cost, and there's no budget provision for it. I think we're at the stage now where the overcrowding's got to the point where they're having to go back to the private sector and ask to buy up those extra spaces, but there is no provision for it in the budget. I think it's been a conscious decision not to use it simply because of the premium that's charged for them.
Simpson.
And just as a point of clarification on the use of the word premium, which I think would imply that these spaces would be more expensive than what is paid for a normal available prisoner place. Just to clarify, and without going into numbers, the cost for an additional prisoner place is significantly cheaper than an available prisoner place.
The cost over and above the already contracted cost of the contract for the prison itself as well.
Phil, because I introduced the term earlier on just because I don't quite know.
Okay, I think Willie.
Thanks, Jerry. Just on that issue, I mean, by and large, the budget allocation supports a number of prisoners within the population. So moving prisoners to Bowhouse or Addiewell is an additional cost. It's an additional cost, and it comes from the budget. It's not cheaper in that sense. It's additional money that has to be found within the system, as I understand it. Is that correct? So it's not cheaper. It's additional money that we didn't have in the first place.
and the Serco. In terms of your capacity, how many additional prisoners today, for example, could you actually take into Kilmarnock and Adderwell? Leave aside the issues of cost and all the rest of it, but in terms of the facility and the capacity you have, what's the difference today between the number of prisoners you have and the capacity of each institution?
So as for Kilmarnock, we can, under the contract, take an additional 96 prisoners over and above what we hold today.
So you could take today 96 extra prisoners?
Yes.
You said under the contract. Do you have physical space for more than 96?
We have 500 cells. We're not the same as Adderwell, that our additional prisoners go into a bunk bed within a current cell rather than a wider cell or a larger cell, the standard
So you
cells.
have 96 additional physical spaces for
So
prisoners.
we have cells with, we can accommodate another 96 prisoners into cells with bunk beds.
And yourself?
So there may have been some changes overnight. I've not seen this morning's figures.
Well, yesterday's figures will do.
But if it's any more than 2 or 3, we're pretty much capped out at 796 currently.
Yeah.
So you're at full capacity.
Full capacity, yes.
So there's an extra 96, maybe 100 between the two. Can I just ask the Chief Inspector, I mean, under the current contract, the unit cost of these additional 96 or the additional ones in Adderwell are higher than the normal mainstream work. But compared to the cost, the additional cost of the consequences of overcrowding, for example, in Berlin, where it does lead to other problems, even if you were buying these additional places at higher unit cost, is there not maybe still a net saving to the system? Because would that lead to reduced problems and reduced costs in the likes of Berlin?
I think we would need to separate out human cost to financial cost. So the cost of buying the private sector places are a financial cost. The cost in Barlini, for instance, is not a financial cost hugely because there are no additional staff being recruited. There are inevitably additional increases in food and clothing and all of those bits. But the reality is with overcrowding, Andrew McLennan referred to it as the 9 evils of overcrowding. And I think the human cost from overcrowding is significant.
I'd like to pick up on that. I think what is often missed is when we talk about space and place, that actually it's the people bit that gets lost. And part of that challenge around managing overcrowding is about moving elements of the population. So we end up moving people around the country out away from where they are, which has implications, of course, on the escort contract, which SPS manages. But that human cost about manoeuvring and moving people away means that actually the implications then for individuals in our care who reside in a prison maybe 200 or 300 miles away from home is not insignificant. And so the human rights aspect of being able to provide the right environment, access to family and so on is often lost in these discussions.
I think it's also just worth remembering it's not just about physical beds for someone to stay in. It's about access to regime, it's about access to visits, it's about the ability to have some space. When you have sort of the best part of 400 prisoners sharing cells, there is no privacy, there is no space, and that's where some of the sort of aggravation comes from, that we are putting lots of people into a very, very small space during those times.
Does anyone know if the Scottish Prison Service has contingency plans in place if the estate actually moves to full capacity or to exceeding its capacity?
Yes, I do know that because that's one of the questions I have asked of both Scottish Government and the Scottish Prison Service, is what contingencies are in place, not just for full capacity, but if, for instance, we have a violent incident that takes out accommodation, or if the infrastructure at Barlini fails.
Answers did you get?
They've got full contingency plans, both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Prison Service.
Can you give us any flavour of what they are? Or
I think that's best asking them at when they become a witness.
Okay. And ask Sarwar.
Nicely to my final point, which is around the estate. So the actual, you mentioned some examples of the condition of the estate of Berlin. It's clear it's not a good working environment. It's clear it's not a good environment for prisoners or indeed people visiting prisoners. Given the fact that you all work so directly with the prison service, do we have any realistic prospect in the near future of having a new built prison that replaces Berlin? And if so, how soon?
Standing is HMP Glasgow, although I understand there's contention about that name, that the funding has been agreed. They're in the commercial negotiations to the new site at Poven Mill and hope to have that in place. That's great, but it's between 5 and 6 years before a replacement prison comes. And during all that time, Barlini's infrastructure is fragile, and I think the overcrowding means that we are fragile as a service.
And just on that fragility, do you think because there's a view that we're going to have a new prison and hopefully it's, in an ideal world, 5, 6 years, it might end up being 10 years, we know how these kind of projects work, is there a stoppage or a blockage in investing in the infrastructure to at least make it fit for purpose for the moment, and therefore gives greater risk that the infrastructure fails and we go into those contingency plans you set out before?
I think there was. I think that's being overcome. So the CPT report and my interim report in Barlini, I think there is significant work underway on 2 levels. One is to look at reducing the prison population with the whole judiciary system. And the second part is to look at finding interim solutions for Barlini so it can continue to run.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'd just like to say I think the issue around maintenance is always is challenging, because that was where certainly there were deemed to be some opportunities for savings. That said, there's an extensive pre-planned maintenance programme across the estate, and Barlini is no different. I think if there is an intent to fundamentally change infrastructure, and by that buildings and so on, then that would not necessarily appear, I don't think, to be best use of the public purse, whilst maintenance of the existing environment is one that would be the priority. That said, there are various other locations around the estate where there is limited occupancy due to the actual condition of the cells, and it particularly manifests in the older estate, Greenock, for example.
Do you know why the Scottish Prison Service is underspending its capital budget, given the pressures we've just discussed?
I think that is a question to be
I know it's a question for the SPS, and I will ask them, but what's your opinion? Does anyone have an opinion on that?
I think in many respects it's where is the will, the political will to be able to invest that money, and partly the manner in which SPS has been funded in the past. I think it's very clear now there is separate operating budget and there is separate capital budget, and I'm sure Chief Executive would have a clear view on how he is able to spend that. Okay,
Phil Fairley?
It's purely speculation, but actually I think the capital money that's not spent is because it was never designed to spend. It wasn't set for something that was in the pipeline to take place. I actually think it's about the headline figure in terms of what the SPS budget looks like, and government knows some of that's coming back to them each year, because on paper they've been given a budget that will look like a particular figure, but in reality there's no capital plans for some of that money to ever be spent. So I think it's a game, to be honest.
Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon?
Well, I think there's 2 elements there. One is the delays in the women's estate.
I was just about to ask you about that, yes.
Yeah, and the capital funding for the women's the custody units. Because that was unable to be spent for a variety of reasons, the capital funding had to be reversed. It couldn't be wired into the operating budget. I think the second thing is always public sector funds, if it's not spent within the financial year, it has to go back in order to be reallocated.
What were the delays? I mean,
I can't answer to that, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay, we'll ask the Scottish Prison Service. And Sarwar, did you have anything further on? Okay. To try and pull this together and wind up, we are going to take evidence from the Scottish Prison Service. If any of you think you want to tell the committee what we should be asking them, what the message is to the Scottish Prison Service, what they need to hear, I'll go around the table and perhaps you can tell me. Phil Fairley, I'm going to ask you to start.
Well, actually, I think in the conversations that we've had with the prison service, we're not far apart in terms of recognising what the problems are and what would fix it. It simply is down to trying to run an ever-expanding prison population with an ever-decreasing budget. We need investment in the infrastructure. It's not just Barlinnie. Barlinnie is always going to be the one that grabs the headlines, but actually there are several prisons that need either rebuilt or heavily invested in capital-wise. But what we need more than anything is the proper staff complement to deal with the prisoner population we've got. That number's not going to drop, it's going to grow, and we need a staff complement that recognises that.
Wendy Sinclair-Graben, do you feel able to answer that?
Yeah, I think there is no evidence of any immediate relief around the prison numbers or of any immediate possibility of having alternative accommodation. And so that tension between the numbers coming into prison and the numbers going out, I think those questions should be asked to Scottish Government. I don't think this is a wholly Scottish Prison Service issue.
We will have the Scottish Government in as well, so these questions can be put. Thank you. Tony Simpson.
Nothing further to add.
Thank you. Steve Farrell.
I would ask the Prison Service and the Scottish Government, and I say this selfishly on behalf of the private sector, is the monitoring of these contracts. I think I've said it for a long while, I think it's perverse that the Scottish Prison Service sit with effectively the public purse and the private purse, and I think that causes some of the problems that's been discussed here today. I think there should be an independent monitor of these two contracts. I think both these contracts and the GOAMI contract and an add-on to the two prison contracts should be reviewed, and a key factor should be in there to allow it to be reviewed on a consistent basis. For simple things like finding mobile phones, finding mobile phones in 1999 in prisons and finding them in 2019 is absolutely night and day, yet the contract remains the same from 1999 to 2019.
Okay.
There needs to be a complete review of that in these contracts and an independent monitor monitoring these contracts.
Thank you very much. Nigel Ironside.
I think we need clarity on what the operating model for prisons looks like. I think the question for both Scottish Government and for the Prison Service is what is expected of the Prison Service, and what does that operating model look like? Is it a human rights based approach, or is it a warehousing approach to manage the ever increasing numbers?
Thank you. Michael Guy.
No, nothing, thank you.
Okay, can I thank you all very much indeed for your evidence this morning, and I close the public session of this meeting as we go into private session.